Okay, welcome back. Late February 1863, which is where we left off, and tough start to the year. A real Pyrrhic victory in northern Bulgaria, and yeah, I mean, not the kind of victory we want to be seeing at all. Not least because really the principal aim of the offensive was to draw in Austrian forces. What we're now faced with is a sudden kind of dramatic instability, which we need to try and recover, and also we need to replace an entire army corps, which was wiped out at the Battle of Plevna. And we need to magic up a 3-star general from somewhere. The only spare one we have, of course, is in Aden. And we are going to have to bring him into the European theatre fairly soon. For the time being, Abdi Pasha's old command, Abdi Pasha having been killed, the second 3-star general we've lost really in 3 months, that is now commanded by a 2-star general, Mehmed Ized Pasha. And he's very raw, and he's also a 2-star general, so he does not have the command points to command such a large force. We've got him and Abdulkarim Nadir pulling back to Sofia with a view of entering the town, or at least Mehmed Ized will be entering the town. Abdulkarim Nadir will be holding a position outside the town. And yeah, it's going to be a dicey dicey month, I think, or two. We need to recover our situation, our cohesion, and recover our defensive posture in central Bulgaria. We've got one of the cavalry divisions being moved up from Trabzon. That's going to be in Sofia in however many days, 3 days. We've also got Abdi Pasha, the second, the son of the recently deceased Abdi Pasha, who is activated as a 2-star general. Very similar stats, fun enough, to his deceased father. Although, of course, his deceased father was a 3-star general who had significantly improved statistics by the time he died. But anyway, gives us another 2-star general. We'll give him command of probably one of the Imperial Guard forces in one of the armies. And yeah, we need to get, when the opportunity presents itself, we've got Bayezid Pasha in the south. We need to get Zarif Mustafa Pasha to Europe. What we are going to do is to begin the construction of a fortress in Aden. And also that's what we're also going to do. Just checking the populations of these regions. We're also going to start building an anchorage, I think, in Dubai. Actually, Qatar. Just to help with the kind of development of this region slightly, and give it maritime access also. It would be a worthwhile exercise at this point. We need to hold out really just for maybe another month or so before we can get Zarif Mustafa Pasha. Yeah, before we can kind of switch him with Bayezid Pasha. I'm trying to think how we're going to do this. He's actually activated. Well, we'll stand on an offensive posture, but we're not going to do very much, unfortunately, this turn. We can't really. We need to keep him kind of outside Sana. That's pretty much it. That's our military moves made, really. So we're getting Mehmed Ali Pasha back into Sofia, bringing all of our forces south, including Hussein Avni Pasha, looking to, again, just stabilise and recover the situation as best we can. Now, we should, give a sense of proportion. It was a victory, although Abdulkarim Nadir Pasha was blamed for that victory, which gives you a bit of a sense as to the character of that victory. And yeah, it was a Pyrrhic victory. So yeah, that's really all we have to do for the time being. At the moment, I mean, with this huge Austrian force that's being assembled in Belgrade, unless we can entice these forces south, I see 5 days. 5 days should be okay. Yeah, if we can entice these forces south, maybe for another go at Salonika, in the weirdest way, that might be welcome. Forces have we got here? Yeah, there's nothing more that we can do in the short term. But if we can entice these, so this Western command that's becoming established by the Austrians. See, this wasn't really foreseen. This wasn't a part of the plan, and we've spent an eye-wateringly large amount of money expanding our transport fleet over the last sort of 6 months, really, or slightly less, 4 months, with a view of obviously conducting some kind of landing this year at the beginning of the campaigning season, which is, you know, moving sort of inexorably closer to us. We kind of settled on Fiume with the idea of conducting a kind of thunder run to Vienna, but with large forces to the south. We don't really want them to respond. You know, I mean, some of the more mobile elements of the force in Belgrade, for example, could move up through to Slavonian. They could possibly, I mean, I'm not sure if they could kind of completely block us. I mean, I don't know. They do look rather bare up here. In the short term, we are going to be bringing our sort of fleet, which has been blockading the northern Adriatic. We're going to bring these boys home. They're running a little bit low on supplies, so we need to get them back into Constantinople for the time being. We are going to set to an offensive posture whilst moving to engage anything that we can. And we have spotted, or we did spot, can't see them now, some Austrian raiders. I mean, this will only show us it looked like 2 squadrons of raiders. I can't see them now. It looks like the can't see how the visibility has changed, but it has. Yeah, that's pretty much it, I think. That's all we're going to do. We are going to check a little kind of interest that we've been developing in Zanzibar. Yeah, so we have a mission and a trade post here, and a colonial penetration which amounts to 35%. We might be in a position, because this is a one-tile entity, to push for protectorate status. It might be challenged by either Prussia or Britain, and we're a little bit cautious there with both of those, especially Britain at this stage. We don't really want to kind of get into fisticuffs with Britain over sort of some kind of remote colonial territory. Let's really quickly check Sumatra, which is another region, of course, we have interest in. Okay, we've got colonial merchants in Jambi. That's a trade post, I think. Well, the Dutch have a mission here in Siak. There's nothing more we can do here. This is a Dutch protectorate now, hence why it's completely controlled militarily by the Dutch. And they appear not to have any kind of serious resistance with the locals. But continuing to develop our position here makes a bit of sense. Okay, let's check the other reports real quick. Black Hills Gold Rush, 1863. Relevant to us because, of course, we are now a gold importer. We've already attached the supply wagons to one of those forces. Economic crisis spread to Baden. Let's quickly check our inflation. It is 0%. Well, the economic crisis has vacated as quickly as it came. That must have just happened this turn. Yeah, the economic crisis is very short-lived. Very short-lived. Did start feeling it slightly, but yeah, inflation has zeroed out. That's really good to see. Excellent. We were sitting about 4% inflation, I think, so that's good. There we go. Yeah, domestic market sales back up then, 170 units for 700, nice. 95 exports for 271, so good rebound on exports as well. Imports are kind of fairly static. Let's quickly check. Okay, we're going to send one of these merchant fleets to the Med. 5 days. Okay, that's good stuff, so... Did not mean to do that. So let's look at the lift capacity then. 284. Let's look at a pretty standard army. 290. .288. So they obviously vary ever so slightly. 278. So Hussein Avenue would be a candidate. Yeah, would be a candidate as a lift. You could even switch out some guns to get him extra cavalry division. He's got 50. 1, 2, 3. I think it'd have to be 3 guns. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. No, it'd actually have to be all the guns, and then we'd switch it. Yeah, we'd switch all the guns out. So it's a question of whether or not we want a bit more kind of mobility or kind of reconnaissance factor, or whether we want the guns. We've got some thinking to do on that, but he is a fast mover. He's probably the best candidate for a Thunder Run to Vienna. And he's located in the east, so we could get him down probably to Salonika. Yeah. We'll think on it, we've got a bit of time, but he's probably the prime candidate, and we already have the lift capacity for his force. So his force is 278, and we have 284. So we actually have the transport capacity and our now colossal fleet. Comprising, I wonder how many ships is this? I'm not going to count them all up, but it's got to be a good 100 or so or more. I reckon it's got to be about 100 transport ships of different sort of character, really. Some of them, obviously, a lot of them are river squadrons, some larger steamships, a couple of Aegis sail ships as well, or flotillas. But yeah, anyway. Okay, yeah, so good round economically. The economy has recovered from the economic crisis, as far as we can see. Let's quickly check on kind of foreign reports. No, okay, nothing to worry about there. I'm going to reduce exports of manufactured goods to 0 for the time being, because we're down to 17. That will quickly we'll quickly make that up, of course. We should be on 49 or thereabouts next turn. Imports of steel, I don't think are no longer necessary. Okay, good stuff then. So we're in late Feb. Gonna put you on pause past turn and see you on the other side in early March. Okay, welcome back. Early March 1863. And an interesting round in terms of kind of actual combat. The only engagement is an Austrian attempt to push our position in Sofia. It's not successful for them. It's a fairly mild battle in the greater scheme of things. Again, a kind of tentative push, although not with a small force. It's a 300,000 man force, but they have plenty of reserves that we can see in the area, and it's ultimately unsuccessful for them, but they maintain a position there in Sofia. That seems to have blocked our attempts to fall back from Plevna. So we've still got two armies sitting in Plevna. The Austrians are pushed down into Varna. They're besieging the town, even though it's not fortified. There is a small garrison force in Varna. And they've been bringing up reserves into Constanța, Bucharest, and it looks like the really large force that they had accumulated in the west. They're moving that through Drobeta, and that's now positioned north of Sofia, possibly looking at a really, really big attack against Sofia. That's it. We've held our own. Before I forget this cavalry division, I'm going to put into Rita Pasha's command. There we go. Very good. Yeah, we've held our own. Mehmed Ali Pasha manages to get back into Sofia. The Austrians push down through Niš. They recapture Niš and the coal mines, and they press a core down into Skopje. They take the town. It's undefended, and probably it looks like they're fixing up for another siege of Salonika. Now, that's the state of play militarily. Hussein Avni Pasha is back in Rumelia, and we kind of re-got our position in central Bulgaria for the time being. Now, the other development this turn, early March 1863, is Austria has offered us a peace deal. It's not a white peace. They are offering to pay reparations, £167,000 or £1 million or whatever it is, over a 1-year period. It's pretty mild. It does constitute a defeat for Austria. It would be a victory for us. So it's not a white peace, it's not a draw. It would require them to vacate Bosnia and any of the areas, Ottoman areas, so Constanța, Niš and so on, sort of, southern Serbia, I suppose. They would have to vacate those regions, and those regions would come back under our control. So it would constitute a victory in this war. Is it the complete, total, absolute victory that we were kind of, looking for, with the idea of maybe, with Austrian forces moving to the east? This does leave our possible move against Vienna as maybe likely, as maybe more likely to come off. The truth is, kind of task force fortune, the landing at Fiume is a huge gamble. It's an absolutely massive gamble, and it might not come off. Further to that, Austria may not offer a peace deal again. What's the reason why they're offering a peace deal? They've been fighting a war for some years. They have sustained very heavy losses, and they calculate that we've been victorious in the last analysis, which is good enough for us. We fought a successful defensive war. They see no way of basically cracking the nut in Bulgaria. And without doing that, they can't really press a claim for Bosnia. It won't suffice for them just to militarily occupy Bosnia. They actually have to force us to accept, and they realize they can't do that. The other development is a significant revolt that has broken out partly in kind of Russian-controlled Congress Poland. It's actually taken Warsaw, which is incredible, and is also spreading southward, into the kind of Austrian part of Poland. That's really interesting. It's not the only revolt the Russians are seeing. They've got a revolt around Minsk in Belarus, and also kind of into sort of the Baltic regions. And it's interesting that Russia's suffering from revolts. They don't have a low sort of national morale or anything like that. It's relatively high. I mean, they control Stockholm, I suppose. But Russia, ever the glass giant, is struggling in some way. This maybe is a kind of scripted event. Maybe it's a real historical event that I'm unaware of, that perhaps it's got a little bit out of hand because Russian forces are tied up to the north and Austrian forces are tied up to the south. So this kind of creates a bit of a vacuum that Polish nationalists are looking to kind of exploit. This might have informed the Austrian decision a little bit. Does it mean that we could end up fighting exactly the same war in 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years' time? Absolutely. In fact, it's extremely likely. And we have to face the fact that we might even end up fighting in Austria at some point and Russia at the same time. You have to keep in mind that Russia has, in an unprecedented fashion, actually has a claim on Constantinople. So Russia is extremely likely to prosecute an aggressive war against us at some point. And it could happen when Austria is at war with us also, or Austria makes the most of this. Imagine how well this war had sort of gone if we had to maintain 2 or 3 army commands in eastern Anatolia. I don't think it would have happened, would it? It wouldn't have worked. Food for thought there. So on that basis, you kind of think, well, the logical thing is to keep fighting a war whilst the Russians are tied up. try and make the most of it as we, that we can, try and occupy Vienna, and there is a real temptation to do that, but it's a huge gamble. It's rolling the dice on our fortunes, it is a victory. This would count as a victory. It's not the wholesale victory that we would like, but we also have to face the fact that we're into, we've been fighting a war we're into the 4th year, really. The war started in January 1860. We're now in early March 1863, and we're fighting the same war. And I can't really see any end in sight. The other thing that's really tilting me towards accepting this peace is the last big battle that we saw at Plevna. This is the first time that we've had a toe-to-toe fight with Austria on fairly even terms. They didn't have any massive numerical advantage, and it was a Pyrrhic victory, but they nearly defeated us, and the losses were hideous. What if that is an omen of things to come? What if that reflects some kind of qualitative technological leap that Austria has? Maybe they've reached some kind of new long-range rifle, or their artillery's become that much more effective. We have a lot of catch-up to do, to sort of be doing. And spending state money on building new army corps and stuff like that is all very well. But with 5 years of peace, may allow us that kind of time to relax the system a little bit, start ploughing some money into our Academy of Sciences. We can start running kind of muzzle-loaded rifles. We could even have parallel 3 kind of technology slots being funded directly by the state. With the kind of gold exchange kind of mechanic that we've got set up, that's doable. And we've got a large enough economy now that we probably won't suffer much inflation. And my thinking is we use this as a breathing space. There's a good chance we will end up fighting a war with Austria again. We have to keep in mind that a resurgent, more powerful Ottoman Empire is seen as a challenge. We're seen as competition. We have more prestige than Austria. Austria's playing second fiddle to us. We've kind of switched places with them. That means that we have a return to the conditions of the 17th and 18th century, where Austria is looking to really aggressively press its claims. It's not simply looking for some crisis in the Ottoman Empire that it can take advantage of and seize Bosnia. It's looking to fight toe-to-toe with us. So there's a really good chance we're going to be fighting this war again. But at the moment, we're just improvising. We've just ploughed a huge amount of resources into a transport fleet. That transport fleet's not going to go away. All those ships aren't going to suddenly sink or anything. We can downsize it a small amount, to sort of reduce our overheads. And a lot of those ships are very readily buildable in a short space of time. So that option can always be open for another war. We need to sort of look to kind of build up officers, train our conscript forces that we have, and we've got a lot of conscript forces, militia, kind of grade infantry. We need to train those infantry. We need time, for example, to roll out new technologies. We've got muzzle-loaded rifles now on a cusp of developing muzzle-loaded rifles. Probably in the next year to 2 years, we'll be able to actually begin to apply muzzle-loaded rifles and systematically arm our troops with rifles. That's a step away from kind of smoothbore muskets. That increases the range damage that our forces can inflict. There's other technologies as well down the road that we can start looking at kind of investing in. So my kind of instinct in this case is to take it, and we shouldn't do it with any kind of sense of disappointment. It's not the sensational victory that we enjoyed in the First Austrian War. We took Vienna. That was a dream come true, And you might kind of think that that's not very realistic. In a sense, you can kind of think it's impossible that the Ottomans could have taken Vienna. I would actually posit what we could do actually is when I finish this turn, or past turn, it's a bit of a weird video this, because they've offered peace kind of like, right at the beginning of the video, really. It's one turn in. So to make it a fairly normal length, and to make it sort of a bit more normal, it's worth talking a bit about the Siege of Vienna, and how I would argue that if the Ottomans had got their act together, with the kind of mobility that 19th century armies offered, and the Ottoman Lezi did as a 19th century army, in a sense, it was more likely that they could have taken Vienna in this period, if, again, in our parallel universes we have, they've really got their act together, than in the apogee of their imperial power, when the Ottomans were their most powerful. I think the odds on taking Vienna was really long, vanishingly long. I don't think they could have done it. I'll explain why. When I pass turn, I'll leave it running, and we'll get kind of 15 minutes where I can ramble a bit about some Ottoman history and stuff like that I find interesting anyway. We're going to take the peace. It isn't the sensational peace that we had in the last war, but let's keep in mind, in the first war, we got out scot-free with the war against Russia. That was pretty touch and go. It's not like the British and the French did much to kind of help us there. So we're going to take the peace. It's not a white peace. It is considered a victory for the Ottoman Empire. That in itself is a sensational accomplishment. What we've done is really, really sterling work. We've had a really tough end to this war. We've lost our greatest general at Kavala, at the end of last year. We just lost Abdi Pasha in a hideously costly fight in Plevna. And if that fight is some kind of yardstick by which we measure future engagements with the Austrians, I don't fancy it. I absolutely do not fancy going toe-to-toe in engagements like that. We're already down on army corps. We've got to construct an army corps, and we have an entire army. Doesn't even have a 3-star general, So we need to get, a 3-star general from Aden, which is going to take how long? A month? 6 weeks? So we're going to take it. It's a victory for us. We'll probably have to fight the same war again in 5 or 10 years' time. Maybe not. Maybe Austria gets tied up elsewhere. But the breathing space would be welcome. To get our house in order, to get some technology squared away, and to get our kind of forces into kind of maybe a slightly better fighting shape. So, Austria offers us a peace. Austria will pay reparations, 167 over a year period. We're accepting it. And that's pretty much going to be it until next turn. In terms of our moves, what we're going to do is fold one of the armies into the other. Creates a massive kind of command penalty. Actually, we're not going to do that. We'll put them in a fortress. In terms of anything else, yeah, I think militarily we don't do anything else, frankly. We just hold tight. It's a fortnight. They've offered it, we've accepted it at the end of the day, so nothing else is going to happen. Right, let's have a quick sort of scout around the Empire. So we've got some light guns coming up from Aden. We've got a decent amount of private revenue and manufactured goods and steel. And what I think that says to us is we press the line down to Baghdad. Good stuff. Let's have a quick look at what's going on in Aden. Now both of these forces are activated. Okay, let's do a conservative attack into kind of Mukalla. And also Hadramut, 16 days. Can we force march him? 60% chance, let's do it. If it comes off, it's 12 days. And if we can hold a position here, as long as we don't experience any massive revolts in the interior, then yeah, we can kind of secure, kind of call on sanitaire perhaps. One thing we are going to start looking to do is to bring more kind of light forces. Do we still have a depot? Yeah, we've still got a depot. With reasonable stocks as well. Okay. So yeah, that's it. The end of the Austrian War. It feels like such an odyssey. It feels like these wars have that effect. You know, like the length of time from January 1860 to 1863 feels like the entire 1850s. You know, it's yeah, such an intense kind of such an intense war. And there's a huge part of me that's kind of filled with relief that there's a way out of it, really, at least in the short term. It's probably the wrong attitude to have, but I just kind of think, yeah, I think in the short term we need the time. We need the time. We need the kind of breathing space. I'm just looking through the other kind of messages that we've got. Okay, let's have these volunteer forces that we have then. These volunteer corps. So we've got some Romanians, some Ukrainians. We are going to disband some of them. So this Landwehr Corps, we're going to disband because we don't want to pay upkeep for all these kind of volunteer forces. So we got some Italians, some Poles, some Hungarians. I think we'll keep. Let's have a look. What else have we got? Okay, and we'll disband one of these formations. I mean, peace is kind of a foregone conclusion now, so okay, good. That lightens the load ever so slightly in terms of transport ships. The only ones we're going to remove are pure Age of Sail ships. Okay. So yeah, what a round. Let's check the economy. We're not exporting any manufactured goods. I have set exports. Assets balance looks good. We're sitting at 3 gold. Now, it's not a bad round in terms of domestic market sales. Big drop off in terms of exports, however. 138 units, 172 units of goods sold for 690. But yeah, big drop off in exports. We actually make slightly more in exports than we spend in imports that term, but with solid domestic market sales. Now we've got a bit of state revenue, so let's look at some kind of some bribing operations we could look to be running. And we'll start building a mission in Aden as well. Ah, I just realised something. We can't move this force, can we? Because we have to keep it in place. Damn. We'll hold these forces in place, actually. Because we're actually prosecuting a military expedition. So we actually have to keep these forces in Sana. Okay. So we're plowing a bit of money then into sort of pacifying Aden, at least as best we can. It'll take a bit of time for that to pay off, but that will hopefully kind of dampen the ability for them to kind of reinforce their forces with continuous revolts. Right, that's it. Yeah, that's it. So peace with Austria. I think we leave it there. This turn, early March 63. Let me just double check I responded to that. It'd be absolutely awful if I failed to. Reply sent. Diplomatic request agreed upon. Yeah, that's fine. I don't want to click to change the reply. Right, that's it. Let's quickly check our other diplomatic arrangements. That would also result in an end to conflict with the with their kind of satellites, you know. Let's have a look at Egypt. Okay, that's it. I'm going to pass turn. And yeah, the war will end in March 1863. The conference table beckons. I can't think of anything else that I need to do. I'll tell you what we're going to do. It's going to bring our escorts home. Probably with the trade fleet in tow for the time being. We'll get them to Smyrna. Because we have Okay, we've got some more merchants. We'll send one of these merchant fleets to Caribbean Maritime box. Right, that's it. Let's pass turn and yeah, witness the Austrian evacuation of Bosnia and southern Serbia together. But yeah. Now I mentioned that I don't think the Austrians could have taken Vienna during their prime, you know, during the early modern period, say the kind of reign of Suleiman, or even the kind of second attempt under the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa at the end of the 17th century. I don't think they could have done it, and not because Vienna was really far away, necessarily. The Ottomans had a real Achilles heel when it came to their military system. And it was sieges. It was actually known as well. Like the Byzantines, before they lost Constantinople, had always calculated that the Ottomans could never take Constantinople. Partly because Constantinople was the best, you know, defended fortress. Really, it was one of the greatest fortresses in history, and it survived 1,000 years. And it had only been sacked once. And the one time it was sacked by, I think it was the Fourth Crusades. There was no attempt to defend it. The Byzantine monarch Isaac, I think it was, simply fled. So from the Byzantine sort of point of view, if you attempted to hold Constantinople, it couldn't really fall. And even though they had lost all of their territory, they thought, well, the Ottomans could never take it. Partly also because they knew that the Ottomans didn't like long sieges. And it was always known that they didn't like long sieges. I mean, the siege of Rhodes was a case where they really, really kind of prosecuted a siege for a long time at unbelievable cost. And the reason that the Ottomans didn't like sieges, or they were quite bad at sieges, is it's kind of, I think anyway, I've not read this anyway, really, by the way, so I'm not sort of just reproducing, you know, you often get people to do this, they'll read a book and reproduce it. It's kind of my own thinking, and it could be wrong, I'm not a historian or anything like that, but I think it's tied in, it's rooted into the character of the Ottoman political system in the early modern period that began to gradually decline, or began to gradually fragment after the reign of Suleiman I. It was very gradual. And yeah, it's sort of the problem they had with sieges was at the heart of their political system, not really their military system. The Ottomans were masters of combined arms warfare, and a lot of that is because the Ottoman military melded together lots of different kinds of military traditions. You know, they had the kind of like pastoral sort of the kind of pastoral light cavalry kind of tactics of the Sipahi, the Timar, the kind of military aristocracy, which they can, as a legacy really of the kind of migrational civilization, and has a lot of the same kind of traditions as the Mongols. The really, really heavy Ottoman cavalry that they copied from the cataphracts of the Byzantines, heavy infantry, the professional military force of the Janissaries, which is completely distinctive and unique for the time. Lots of different military traditions that they kind of, they sort of brought together, but they really struggled with sieges. And you can see with the siege of Constantinople, they went to great lengths to adopt measures that would kind of reduce the length, would make the siege not very long lasting. So they employed really large cannons for the first time, specially made for the siege. Also, they used great engineering feats, like they moved their entire fleet overland into the city bay, which was extraordinary. They managed to pull that off. But they did all of this because they didn't want to just sit and starve the city out. And the reason for that is the Ottoman political system was a really elaborate political system that was designed to really insulate the ruling house from any kind of political challenges from their own aristocracy. It was very, very distinctive to the Ottoman system. And it meant that the Ottoman Sultan had much more power than any European monarch, including a Tsar of Russia, including a Byzantine emperor, certainly including a Roman emperor, when you consider that all Roman emperors up until the reign of Diocletian basically were consuls for life. They had to pretend to be consuls. They actually had to fulfill some of the roles of consuls, An Ottoman Sultan had much, much more power, really. They were far less challenged in some ways than these other monarchs. And that's because they couldn't really be challenged by their aristocracy. And they had lots of traditions and institutions in place. This is relevant to sieges, by the way. I think it kind of underpins why they had a problem with sieges. They had lots of traditions and institutions in place that were designed precisely to ensure that they were distanced from the Timariates, the Timars, the military aristocracy of the Ottoman Empire. One of them was the harem. Of course, the harem is stocked with slaves, slave girls, usually from the Balkan Peninsula, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, Bosnia. And the harem is depicted in Western society as in a kind of slightly camp way, as a decadent luxury, sort of carry-on-esque character to it. And there's a reason for that. It's a really age-old kind of Christian tradition of trying to draw parallels between Islam and Greco-Roman polytheism, kind of culture of sexual promiscuity and decadence. But the harem didn't exist as a personal pleasure. A monarch didn't really need a harem to facilitate that. The harem existed so that the ruling house could reproduce in a way that didn't really require the aristocracy to be involved. It ensured that none of the aristocratic families ever had any kind of sense of parity with the ruling house. Of course, the aristocracy of any other kingdom in Europe is a really important part of the reproduction of the monarchy, and the monarchy kind of twins reproduction with the cultivating of political alliances. You'd intermarry with powerful aristocratic families, and the function of that is to build a political base for the ruling house, so that in the event of a crisis, you could call upon powerful allies and this sort of thing, and it pegs really the fortunes of powerful families to your own, and ultimately moves those families closer to the center of power themselves, so in the event of a succession crisis, they might have a credible claim. The Ottomans were not interested in any of that kind of thing at all. They used an institution to reproduce, an institution that was kind of essentially governed by the state bureaucracy, the administration, and they allowed the ruling house to reproduce without them needing to build political alliances in the aristocracy, for the aristocracy to have any kind of claim to the throne. So the harem is one. The other thing that they have is fratricide. Fratricide is upon the succession of an Ottoman monarch. In today, this stuff doesn't really exist too much by this time. It's a system that's it's sort of in a deep state of decay by this time, and is replaced by new kinds of institutions by the mid-19th century. But fratricide is upon the succession of a new Ottoman monarch. The brothers of that monarch are pretty instantly put to death. And sometimes they might even know that their parents have died. The Sultan may have died. The successor is already selected beforehand, and riders will be sent out to various other brothers, all of whom will be in a kind of house arrest anyway before the death of the monarch. They would live in a kind of permanent state of house arrest. And they're put to death. That sounds rather grisly and nasty stuff. The reality is that happens everywhere. It happens in every kingdom. It's just that in most other places, kingdom in Europe, most other places this happens on the battlefield. It involves the death of tens of thousands of other men. It involves all kinds of crises. And for the most part, this allowed succession to be relatively stable. Succession is the most dangerous time in the life of a ruling house. Anyone that's played CK2, which is pretty good, you know, I mean, it's a pretty decent, I think, kind of depiction of medieval society in some ways. But yeah, it's obviously the most dangerous period in the life of a kingdom, of an empire, and of a ruling house. This allows for succession to be relatively stable. For one, upon the succession of a new monarch, there is no aristocratic family that has any credible claim to the throne, and all of the other kind of competitors are bumped off instantly. The other system that the Ottomans have, which I've kind of mentioned in previous videos, is devshirme and endurun. And devshirme is a system whereby the Ottomans would accumulate slaves from the Balkan Peninsula, Bosnia, Bulgaria, Greece, and so on. And they weren't chattel slaves. They were slaves. They were taken as young boys. They were brought to Constantinople. They'd be snipped, turned into eunuchs, and they'd be raised as educated bureaucrats, administrators. Many of them would. They'd be, given a good education. They'd be taught mathematics and astrology and all these kinds of things, you know. And religion, they were raised as strict Muslims as well. And the imperial college is the system to be sent through Endurun. These kind of devshirme slaves would be sent through Endurun. And Endurun is a kind of finishing school that provides the empire with an administration. And that administration governs the empire. So you don't have a system like, if you think about the Byzantines, the powerful strategos, the military aristocracy, you know, the really powerful figures would be given titles. And those titles would require certain kind of duties, functions. They would have to be in Constantinople with the monarch. You know, maybe they are Sebastocrator or something like that. They have some kind of important role that they have to fulfill, which means they're close to the monarch. And of course, they might also be married into the ruling house as well, which creates all kinds of complications. You know, you have a situation where you're surrounded potentially by enemies. The Ottoman Sultan is surrounded by eunuchs, people that cannot reproduce. So they can't have the establishment of powerful bureaucratic families. This does happen much later in its history, after the reign of Suleiman I. He relaxes the kind of criteria for entry into Endurun, and you do eventually have very powerful bureaucratic families established in the kind of 17th and 18th century. The Kuprulus, that I don't know how many grand viziers they provided. There must have been 10 or more, you know. But not so much the case in their earlier history, in the kind of the classical kind of Ottoman period. So yeah, the aristocracy is not required to govern the empire. You have a civil service, a kind of bureaucracy, and the institution of Endurun, the imperial college, means that even though the bureaucracy is kind of pinched off with each generation, the accrued experience and learning of that bureaucracy is distilled within that institution and passed on. The other part of Endurun, of course, the other part of the imperial college, is the Janissary Corps, which I've talked about in a previous video. And the Janissaries, they're not just professional soldiers, they are Spartan-esque professional soldiers, raised as children, again, a lot of them Christian slaves in the Balkan Peninsula, or most of them, in fact all of them, and they are trained from a very young age to be children, taught in hand-to-hand combat, CQB, systematically drilled in the use of firearms, raised in the toughest parts of Constantinople, and encouraged to engage in gang warfare, you know, so these were really, really hardened soldiers. And the real function of the Janissaries, even though they're really effective against foreign foes, of course the real purpose is to provide the monarch with a professional standing army. And it doesn't matter how tough the Timars are, the military aristocracy, the Sipahi, and they were a tough aristocracy. It doesn't matter how tough, even if you've got a gang of them together, like a kind of faction of them, they're not going to get past the Janissaries. It's just not going to happen. So you have this really elaborate system then that's designed to insulate the ruling house from challenges from the military aristocracy. So how does this pertain to sieges? My thinking is that sieges, first of all, to actually seal a city off, like Constantinople, and if you look at the early sieges where they're successful, they still had troubles. They had political problems. Sieges are a really fraught political moment for Ottoman sultans, okay? For one, you have to have a really large army to pull off a siege, to completely envelop a city. You need an army of 100, 200,000 men if it's a large city like Vienna, okay? And for that, the Ottoman standing army anyway wasn't just the Janissaries. The Janissaries might be a corps of 30, 40, 50,000, maybe 100,000, depending on what period in its history. But that's really just the elite core of its army. You know, the rest of its army is comprised of the Timariats. You know, they provide themselves on horses, the Sipahi, the kind of the mobile element of their army, and also, of course, if you like, the people that live inside their Timars, their army. So the army is made up of the Timariats force, which is really the kind of lion's share of their army. So in a siege, you're surrounded by a military aristocracy that your entire political system is designed to disenfranchise and remove from power. And of course, siege is a really fraught time. Besieging a city, the condition of an army that's besieging a city is only slightly better, I would argue, than the conditions of an army that is in a besieged city. Before you have supplies and logistics, which you see during this period beginning to emerge, with supply trains and this kind of thing, before you really have that, an army that's static and surrounding a city and besieging a city is urinating and defecating in exactly the same area that it's drawing its water supplies from, and probably pillaging for food. So disease spreads very, very quickly, and armies suffer massive losses as a result of disease when they're besieging. This happened, I think, in both sieges of Vienna. The Ottoman army had serious problems with disease. And if soldiers don't die from disease, then they face the prospect of utterly futile attempts at charging fortified positions, which might require many, many attempts before it's successful. Now, one dangerous element of besieging a city, one dangerous factor, is that Ottoman soldiers, not all Ottoman soldiers, but a large part of the Timurid army would have been paid on the basis they weren't like peasant levies like a medieval France or England. And maybe because they had a large number of smallholders, it was a bit more of a pastoral kind of society, more so in their earlier history, that they might have had a lot of yeomen, smallholders, and sort of herders and this kind of thing. That the way that the army would be paid would be on the promise of war booty. I don't mean arse, well, not just arse, but of course looting cities. This is not a distinctly Ottoman thing. It's as old as warfare. It goes right back to antiquity, that armies would be paid by given the opportunity to loot cities. Heavily fortified cities are going to contain a lot more loot. These are prized possessions. And the basic policy in Constantinople was the contents of the city is yours, the Sultan would say to the soldiers, but the buildings are mine. As long as you don't damage the buildings or anything like that, you're given 2 or 3 days to do what you want. If you survive the siege, you get to loot the city, take anything you want, and behave how you want, basically. That's the reward for a lot of these soldiers, So once you're besieging a city, it's really dangerous to break off a siege, because the carrot on the end of the stick for these men to endure what they're enduring is that they manage to get into the city. And of course, these men are all led by a military aristocracy that is going to be looking to kind of prize concessions. Okay, you want the siege to carry on for another 6 months. We've lost 50,000 men. There's a lot of restlessness in the ranks. We can do it, but we want some kind of concession. Maybe we can look at maybe relaxing the rules for entry into Enduran, for example. Maybe Sipahi, maybe some of the aristocracy can join. Maybe some of the aristocracy are allowed to join or have commanding roles in the janissaries. You can see how this would go, right? So this is one of the problems with long sieges. It's why the Ottomans hated long sieges, I suspect, is that it's tied into the kind of the political character of the early Ottoman state. And in both the siege of Constantinople and both sieges of Vienna, it was very, very easy for their opponents to make inroads into the inner circle. And not just because it was the Ottomans. This was the case in any siege of any army. It's very easy. If you imagine during both sieges of Vienna, you might have some, Ottoman corsair, and maybe he has, business interests with the Walloons, the Belgian Jewish family that administered the Austrian finances. This is a really good conduit straight away. This is an example into the kind of inner circle of the Sultan. Okay, on that basis, you can set up a wire to pull with maybe a couple of sympathetic Timars, maybe also even members of the bureaucracy. In the siege of Constantinople, it's widely felt that the Grand Vizier, who is a bureaucrat, administrator, it's widely thought that he's in the pay of the Byzantines, and once the city is taken, he's executed. So you can see even then, even with the Byzantines on their knees, are able to make tremendous inroads into the kind of inner circle of the Sultan. So this would have been the case of the siege of Vienna as well. Vienna would have been unbelievably well defended as well. When Austria was a kind of an archduchy, or whatever it was, before it was an empire, when its kind of infancy, it was a part of a confederation of German states, which of course was the Holy Roman Empire, increasingly decentralized in the early modern period, but routinely, the archduchy, I believe it was a duke of some kind in Vienna, would be elected as the Kaiser of the Holy Roman Empire, confederation including German principalities and states, but also northern Italy. It was a really important part of kind of Catholic Europe before the Reformation. And the ruling house in Austria was, of course, Habsburg, and was related to the ruling house in Madrid. Spain is a superpower in the Christian world, of course, in the early modern period. So there's a lot of resources, a lot of resources are poured into ensuring that Vienna was defendable. And also in this period, Europe was going through a military revolution, partly inspired by the Ottomans. Their fortresses are becoming much more complex. Certainly by the second siege, Vienna was a kind of star fort. And I would suggest that was much more central to the Ottoman failure to take Vienna than any kind of Ottoman intervention by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Jan Sobieski and this sort of thing. The Poles intervene in the second siege, and the Ottomans were quite badly defeated and struggled to recover from that defeat as well. They lost most of Hungary on the basis of the second siege of Vienna. But so anyway, my thinking is, that's my theory. My theory is, it was known that they weren't fond of sieges. They were fond of really quick solutions in the field. They liked pitched battles in a kind of, and they excelled at pitched battles, kind of Mohacs and Mohatch and this sort of thing. They liked big pitched engagements where they could kind of utilize their combined arms and this sort of thing really, really effectively. And certainly with an elite professional force, Spartan-esque force with firearms at the heart of their army, they were going up against kind of traditional European kind of feudal armies of just levied peasants and this kind of thing, easy meat really. But by the kind of 16th and 17th century, Europe's undergoing a kind of military revolution. It's a whole different kind of ballgame. And that's a key thing as well. Europeans all of a sudden arming themselves with arquebuses, muskets of sorts, firearms and this kind of thing. And their fortifications are becoming much more elaborate, much more complex. Star fort means that if you try and kind of scale any wall, you have a wall flanking you to your rear, exposing you to kind of withering fire from crossbows and arquebuses and all this kind of thing. And also, artillery, early cannons are much less effective against kind of what is essentially sloped armor fortifications. Anyway, that's my thinking. That's why I think the Ottomans would just never would really have struggled to take Vienna. Even if Vienna was, as far south as Sarajevo, if enough resources were poured into it by the whole of Catholic Europe, and the whole of Catholic Europe really came together to try and ensure that Vienna did not fall. Huge amounts of resources were poured into that fortification. I think they would have struggled because it was their Achilles heel. They would have defeated any European army in the field. Any European army, Spain, the entire Holy Roman Empire, they would have done it, and they would have done it again and again and again during the time of sort of Selim and and Suleiman. But I think they really struggled with sieges. Less so in the 19th century. The 19th century is a different ballgame. Not least because Vienna, of course, is no longer a frontier city. We took advantage of that. It's no longer fortified. The city has outgrown the citadel. But anyway, that's my thinking on the siege of Vienna. And that brings us to the end of our third war. That's the strangest thing I've ever seen. I didn't realise you could move parts of the city. Extraordinary. I've never seen that. Don't want to do it too much. I don't really want to move Smyrna into a different location. But yeah, extraordinary. So that's it. We have arrived at a peace deal. Straight away we get a nice big boost of money. And what is Austrian prestige? 7874. No great prestige change or anything like that, but yeah, that's the end of the war. Sarajevo's back in our hands. We're possibly still at war with some of their kind of puppets. Oh no, hang on, I'm looking at Austria's. So they're at war with two Sicilies, Serbia, Montenegro, Papal States. Yeah, Baden, Bavaria, and Saxony still. So peace will follow with those. Them. Yeah, big moment for Abdelaziz. Of course, he came to power in the midst of this war, and yeah, he's seen it out. Peace has arrived. We've got a decent amount of kind of revenue built up. We're actually going to invest in our education system straight off the bat. That's going to take 500. That'll leave us with 300. Yeah, what a war. I mean, this would have been one of the bloodiest wars in human history as well. Think of that. And the fact that we were able to hold our own as an empire. You think of the Ottomans in the 1860s, fairly deep state of decay. I mean, In the late 1870s, they got absolutely hiding at the hands of Russia. That might still happen. You know, Russian forces are already making an appearance. That's depressing. Imagine if a Russia war follows, you know, seamlessly. Could happen. We have seen that Russian force make an appearance before, so we shouldn't be too alarmed. Furthermore, it may have been there the entire time, and simply nothing happened because, of course, we couldn't see it because we didn't control Constanta. But yeah, the Austrians have vacated Constanta then, southern Serbia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. The war is over, and yeah, it's been one hell of a war. Easily one of the bloodiest wars in human history, I'd imagine. I reckon that in terms of deaths, not just casualties, Austria might have suffered something to the tune of 700,000 to 1 million deaths in that war. I think we suffered less. I'd say we suffered in terms of deaths 2, 3, maybe 400,000. But yeah, a very, very bloody war indeed, and over. And we won. I almost feel a pang of sentimentality for it being over. It's extraordinary, but yeah. There we go, and we're kind of back to business as usual for the time being, until something else happens. You know, there's a chance that Russia could declare war. If I'm honest with you, I'm really hoping for a long period. Look at the chaos of the Balkans, all these signs of looting and pillaging, all the damage to our kind of Balkan provinces. That'll take time to heal. You know, hopefully a year or so, and we'll have a lot of the damage will be kind of undone. One thing we will look to do is to press the railroad up from Niš to Sarajevo forthwith, and we want to also build up the fortress itself. So the first thing is to extend the fortress at Sarajevo. That's 45 state revenue, 9 manufactured goods. That's the first thing on the order of the day, I think. We're also going to extend the fortress at Sofia. And a Plevna. That leaves us a little light manufactured goods and steel, but that's a big outlay. Counterintuitive that we're spending a lot of money on military stuff early on, but we want to do it as sooner rather than later. Extend the fortress, and I've got a bit of a plan, which I won't talk too much about now, but we're going to start building a lot of fortress garrison troops with guns. The idea is to build up super fortresses. What we've done in Constantinople and Adrianople, we're going to kind of replicate that elsewhere. We're going to have linchpin locations, so we're going to have Sarajevo, Plevna, because we now have an open gap here. Plevna and Constanta are going to be turned into monster fortresses. Salonika, it's going to be basically Constanta, Plevna, Sofia, Salonika, and Sarajevo. We're going to enlarge in the depot, build a railroad connection up to Sarajevo, and yeah, if we intend to hold it in the next war, you know, it may not happen. This game can be really surprising and counterintuitive. Austria may not declare war again for the rest of the game. Well, they might declare war next year. They might declare war in 6 months' time. You know, it's just like that. I mean, Russia could go to war this next month. Or they might not at all, you know. We're kind of not at their mercy. And at some point, we could be looking to prosecute, you know, our own kind of war on our own terms. Aggressive kind of wars, but not for some time, I think. And as the Ottomans, the wars really will come to us. So, we currently can't see Austria listed. We've got Bavaria. I don't know why that is. They'll make an appearance soon enough, but yeah. So yeah, initial outlays then, a big investment in education. That's going to take up most of our state revenue. We'll still have 156 left, and then yeah, some outlays for expanding our fortresses. Sofia is already a large fortress, as is Constanta, I believe. Yeah, maybe even Sleven at some point. But we'll be looking at upgrades. So we're going to be looking to upgrade. I think Sofia is being upgraded. We'll be looking to upgrade Salonika and Constanta, I think. Yeah, probably in the next couple of months. That's it then. I'm actually going to leave the video here. It's probably a reasonably long video anyway, because I kind of passed turn and left it sort of, left it running. Got to chat a bit about some Ottoman history and sieges and stuff. And what I'll do then is we'll go back to some business reports. So we're in late March. That's kind of a quarterly report, really. We kind of know where we are for spring 1863. The next report then will pick up probably midsummer. So June, July. I'll press through, pass a few turns, and give you a bit of an update and look at sort of our plans for restructuring our army, military redeployments. We need to start looking at Eastern Anatolia. That's another area we might want to start looking at, kind of plowing resources into fortresses and stuff like that, and some plans for our army, and also Aden. One thing that we do need to do is, we didn't really notice it happening because it didn't happen all at once, but one area where we suffered with attrition is a lot of irregular forces. Bashi bazooks, often in these towns. We had quite a lot of these. These are very small forces, paramilitary forces that were scattered around the Balkans. They often got caught up in advances. Sometimes they were in towns and they were bypassed, for example in Pristina. Bashi bazooks are really a legacy of our 18th century army as well. These are irregular formations. You often see kind of Orientalist paintings of the Ottoman Empire. They often didn't really like painting regular Ottoman soldiers because they looked boringly Western in modern military uniforms and modern weapons for the most part. What they tended to paint lots of pictures of is Bashi bazooks because they were a bit of a relic of the past, and they were still around in the 19th century, and they often had irregular kind of very irregular kind of pattern uniforms, civilian dress, but not really civilian dress, kind of not quite normal civilian dress. Yeah, it was a kind of military tradition of its own, with its own strange kind of customs and military styles and this sort of thing. And yeah, to Western eyes, they love this. So Western painters often painted Bashi bazooks. We are going to be looking at phasing the Bashi bazooks out, however, and replace them with small brigades of regular military forces. They've sort of had their day ready, so we'll be looking at kind of infantry brigades or even just conscript brigades, which are a little bit cheaper. Yeah, it requires less officers. And the other thing, we are going to start looking to do is building lots of kind of garrison and fortress forces. So these garrison forces can replace a lot of the Bashi bazooks. With towns, for example, that don't have fortresses, we can just have a small garrison force there. Very, very small force of, like, what they comprise of. You're talking like 3,000 men. But that's good for a small town, a settlement that doesn't have a fortress. It means if there's any kind of revolt in the area, insurgency, which we haven't seen much of. We should keep in mind that, since the kind of mid-1850s, the industrialization of the empire has expressed itself with a remarkable kind of domestic stability. But that's not a foregone conclusion. That's always going to be the case. So we'll be looking at garrisons, fortress forces also. We have a more modern variety of fortress troop and a more traditional fortress troops. I think the modern variety may have access to a Gatling gun. And we'll build them in Anatolia, but move them on rails. And we're going to build these, a significant quantity of these, actually. And begin to kind of beef up our fortresses. So the next turn of the circle, we'll be in a really strong position to hold Austrian or Russian forces in these fortresses to allow us to kind of, inflict stinging casualties on the Austrians should they attempt to assault them. That's the idea, to make these almost impenetrable, or as close as possible. And then we'll do the same thing, bring our forces to bear in central Bulgaria, and then look to kind of make the most of their failed attempts to storm the fortresses. It's a basic kind of defensive tactic that we have. And something similar, we wanted to redeploy a force to Eastern Anatolia. We have a modern large fortress of Kars, incidentally, which we haven't neglected. We arranged for that in the 1850s before the Second Austrian Wars. That's good. But that's it then. The war's over, and the Ottoman Empire won its second war against Austria. Less dramatic, but a much more serious and committed kind of fight from the Austrians this time round. And we win. We're the winners until the next turn of the circle. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.